Hello there people of the internet, I am CJ the Prop Maker and welcome back to another video. Now, if you've been following my channel for some time now, you will know that I am deeply interested in swords and other medieval weapons. A quick glance around my bedroom will show you that I am very much into medieval stuff, which includes swords, daggers, and other medieval weaponry, as well as armor. Most of these weapons and swords I have made myself because up until recently I was unable to start purchasing stuff online, and I lived in a small South African town, so if I wanted a sword, pretty much the only way to get it would be to make it. And so I've been making my own swords for years, and for years I have also been trying to get into a sword-related recreational hobby, be it fencing, HEMA, or even live-action roleplay. And live-action roleplay seems like the most appealing option for me. I'll tell you why. Firstly, there are, so far as I can tell, no fencing clubs anywhere in South Africa, and there is a HEMA club in Durban, the Knights of Durban I think they're called, or something along those lines, but the price for entry is quite expensive because you need to have a properly made steel helmet as well as several pieces of properly made steel armor and a properly weighted blunt steel sword, or else you will not be able to get in. And as you might know, if you've ever thought of purchasing any of these things, is that properly made steel anything is heck of an expensive. So not a very viable option. If I get the chance, then I might be tempted to give it a go, but otherwise I feel like live action roleplay is the best option for me. Which brings me to the subject of this video. I've finally done it. I've gone ahead and bitten the bullet and purchased some LARP swords, battle-ready foam swords from a fairly budget-friendly company that I will not mention just yet. I will wait until the swords actually arrive, and then I will give my thoughts in a part 2 to this video. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Why would you go ahead and purchase LARP swords when you've already made several of them? Well, yes I have. But it can never hurt to have an expert benchmark for future projects, now can it? And so I bought these because I've never actually held a properly made LARP sword in my life. I've seen people swinging them around and I've seen people holding them, but I've never actually held one. So I bought these so that I can have an expert idea about how LARP swords actually should feel, so that I can have an idea and that I can hold all future projects to a certain standard. That, or I've been corrupted by capitalism and Tim Curry is very disappointed in me. Either way, it's not going to change the fact that I am still very proud of what I have done with what I have. So, without further ado, I'm going to be going over the foam swords that I have made, their pros and cons, and whether or not I would actually trust them on a LARP field. Just a heads up though, I will only be reviewing the stuff that I have finished and the stuff that I have tested out in a casual sparring match. I will also be covering no boffer swords, because I have made some of those, but I will only be covering the ones that could be classified in a pinch as foam latex highly detailed weapons. These are the foam swords that I have made. Well, 4 foam swords and 1 foam dagger to be precise. They are made using yoga mat foam, lightweight clay, cloth tape, plastidip, and several other miscellaneous materials including leather, vinyl, spray paint, and several other materials, including graphite cores using parts from old fishing rods, and this big one here has an old golf club as the core. So yeah, they all have graphite cores rather than fiberglass. They are flexible, but they are not perfect by any means. Each weapon has a cloth reinforced tip, and the core ends 2 inches from the tip of each blade. so you could thrust with them, but I've never risked it. The first thing I look for in a good LARP sword is whether or not I can feel the core through the foam. For most of these I cannot, at least along the striking surface I can't do that. First up, we've got the dagger. As you can see, very typical dagger design. I think this is the type of dagger that they would call a Quillon dagger. I just went with a typical dagger design that I like very much. As you can see, handle wrapped in vinyl, and can I feel the core through the striking surface? No, I cannot. Also, the blade doesn't really compress very well, but on a dagger that doesn't really matter that much. You can thrust with this tip, no problem. It's got a decent amount of give. The crossguard here is reinforced on the inside with flattened PVC. So if you want to parry with the crossguard, it is going to offer some resistance, and you can push enemy blades aside. So decent dagger. Would not suggest parrying with the blade though, because the core of this one is fairly flexible and there is a chance that it could snap. So if you want to parry, I suggest you do so with the guard. Then there's the first LARP sword I ever made, this kind of cutlassy type deal. Now you might be asking, why is the blade so notched looking? Well, that's because in the beginning I had a bit of trouble when I was grinding the blade on the belt sander, and I kind of lost control and gouged the foam deeper than I wanted to in some places. And then I figured, I'll just hand wave it and pass it off as simply a well-worn cutlass. Can I feel the striking surface through the foam? Not really. Not really, no. This one compresses fairly well. The tip does have a decent amount of flex. The only trouble with the paint that I used here, the trouble with Plastidip is that it doesn't really agree very well with certain types of spray paints. For example, I can't remember what brand of spray paint I used for this one. I think it was Nazca, I think, but it has a tendency to flake off, and as you can see, it's colored my fingers silver from simply running my fingers along it, and it has the tendency to get crumpled. But if you ever run into this problem with LARP weapons, I find if the weapon starts to crumple in places, that can lead to the Plastidip or the latex cracking as well, which can compromise the weapon's safety. And what you should do there, in my experience, is run the crumpled zones underneath a heat gun on low temperature or a hairdryer. This will lessen the crumpling and will therefore extend the shelf life of your sword. Next, I made this one, Excalibur inspired LARP arming sword. The crossguard is fairly chunky and is made out of 3 solid bits of foam sandwiched together and held in place with a lot of cloth tape, and then decorated with hot glue for details. I didn't feel the need to reinforce the crossguard. It's pretty solid, not perfect, but it'll pass. Can I feel the core? No, not really, and compresses nicely. I think this is the best LARP sword I've made so far, and it feels good in the hand. Next, I made this one. This is actually my favorite. It is inspired by the sword Geralt carries in the Netflix Witcher series. It's a bastard sword, which means it's a hand-and-a-half sword. The crossguard, much like the dagger, is reinforced with PVC on the inside, so it can be used for parrying. Compresses rather nicely. I'd say this weapon is very comparable to this one. I cannot feel the core anywhere through the foam. Tip compresses nicely. Oh, I forgot to show you the tip on the other one, but it basically compresses just as much as this one. And so yeah, I would pass this for a LARP inspection. I don't see why this wouldn't pass. But then again, that might be just my layman's perspective talking. And finally, I made this a two-handed, well, what some LARPs would consider a two-handed greatsword. But if you ask any history enthusiasts, they would say this is more longsword length, and it is obviously very Viking inspired, and that's also giving some history buffins a aneurysm right now, because who ever heard of a two-handed Viking sword, you heretic? Well, it is more of a fantasy design, so cool your jets please. Skullgrim, Shadowversity, Metatron. This is fantasy. This is not historical. So it has this very long blade with some bronze detailing. Handle is wrapped in leather and vinyl. Feels pretty good in the hand. I gave the blade this worn texture on the inside and I made the edges all shiny. The blade is a bit iffy in some places where I didn't control the sander as much as I wanted to, and so there are some spots where it sank in a bit. You can see over here, and in some places I can feel the core through the flat of the blade. But then again, who's going to go around and strike people with the flat of their LARP sword? I don't know. But through the striking surface, I can tell you that I cannot feel the core at all. Doesn't compress as well as the others, but it still compresses quite a fair deal, and the tip does collapse here. In terms of my first ever two-handed LARP sword, I think I did pretty well. As I said before, each of these swords is painted with plastidip, which means that there is always a risk of the weapons getting all sorts of torn up and having to replace the layers and repaint them. But that sort of thing, so far as I've learnt, is customary with homemade LARP weapons. You always need to maintain them and repaint them and relayer them and what have you. So that comes with the territory, so I haven't much problem with that. Now, would I trust my homemade swords at an actual LARP group? Well, yes and no. Yes, because so far as I'm concerned, these all fulfill at least halfway several safety requirements. No, because I made them and some of them have problems. Like I mentioned, with the greatsword, you can feel the core through the flat of the blade, and the dagger is a bit more solid than the others. So if it just so happens that all of these weapons would pass the safety inspection, then I would have no problem letting just whoever rent these weapons for live action roleplay purposes and take them out onto the battlefield. But if I had the option myself, if I were running a LARP and I looked at the stuff that high-end LARP groups were selling versus these, and a bunch of player characters were coming with high-end LARP weapons versus these, I would rather stick to giving these weapons to NPCs. These random characters that are just walking around the game area as sort of, for want of a better term, player fodder. You know, just like if you need to equip a bunch of bandits to lay upon the player characters like, we're gonna mug you, hand over all of your gold, yeah, just if you need to equip a bunch of mobs for the players to fight, then that's what I would suggest using these weapons for. But if they pass your LARP safety inspection, then I'd say go for it. Yeah, I give these weapons a pass. And now it's time for me to get overly critical. I will be judging these weapons based on 5 fields. These fields are safety, durability, aesthetics, ease of purchase, and speed of delivery. In terms of safety, I am fairly confident that each of these weapons are safe for cutting and slashing maneuvers, but I do not honestly think that they will hold up to continuous attempts at thrusting and stabbing maneuvers. So all in all, in terms of safety, I am going to give them a 7.5 out of 10. Now, durability. In terms of durability, with Plastidip, you will always have to replace it after heavy use because the Plastidip is going to get torn off. You will be able to see the foam, or in this case the tape, through the paintwork. You get the point. The rubber gets torn off, you'll have to replace the rubber, you'll have to repaint it, etc. The Plastidip having to be replaced after heavy use, that leads me to give them a durability score of 7 out of 10. Now, in terms of aesthetics, with homemade swords you are really open to do whatever you want with it, so long as it is within the LARP's safety regulations. And with high-end LARP weapons, you don't really get that option. I know Kalimasil has a custom sword builder where you can choose your hilt and blade and color and what have you, but you're still choosing from a limited catalogue of options. Whereas with homemade weapons, you can just make your own design and you can make it however you want it to be, etc. So you really can't fault homemade weapons for giving you freedom of choice. And in terms of making things that are clearly dull foam LARP weapons, but still retaining a realistic look to them, I think I did a pretty good job. Not the most realistic by any means. I mean, if you have an understanding of functional sword design, then you can look at this and you can tell, that's a fake sword, that's definitely not a real sword. So, not very realistic, but for a foam sword, I think this still looks pretty good. At least it looks much better, in my opinion, than any of the stuff you can find for sale on Hero's Edge. So in terms of aesthetics, I am going to give my homemade swords an 8 out of 10. Now in terms of cost, if you keep in mind that the average price for a budget-friendly LARP sword is around $50 US, then homemade LARP weapons are really, you get a lot of value for your money. Because if you keep in mind the price of Plastidip, fiberglass rods, cloth tape, yoga mat, etc., then you're looking at around 800 Rand, which is about $60 US. And so for that price you would be able to get around one budget-friendly LARP weapon. But for homemade stuff, if you buy all of this to make stuff of your own, you can easily get, if you use it in a savvy manner, you can get at least, like you see here, you can easily get 5 LARP weapons out of it if you use it wisely. So in terms of cost, I am going to give homemade weapons a 10 out of 10. So there you go, those are my thoughts and feelings on my homemade foam swords. I'm still very happy with what I managed to do with what I had, and if I do get the chance to use them at a LARP event, then I am certainly going to give it a whirl. And I will be doing further research into both Mead Legends and Tales of Tiana to see if they are still active, and if they are, well, then I will be gathering a few of my friends, and we will be going soon on a road trip down to Joburg to do some LARPing and what have you. I might do a video on that if and when it happens. And if they are not active, well, I have access now to a location which would be great for a live action roleplay event, and I can host my own. So yeah, thank you all for watching. I've been CJ the Prop Maker, and stay tuned for part 2 where I do a review of my new battle ready foam swords. If you like this video, then slash that like button right down the middle, and I will see you in the next one.